Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar discussion video. This one is going to be about a variety of different Avatar fantasy fights or versus series, whatever way you want to call it. Me analysing potential fights between specific characters from Avatar and Korra. I put up a YouTube community post yesterday and asked you guys which fights you wanted to see me analyse, and you sent me in a bunch. I don't know if I'll be able to get through all of them. I'll probably only be able to get through half of them without the video being super long, but I'll get through a bunch of them here. So I suppose the final thing before we just jump straight into the first fight is the way I'm going to be doing this is that I don't think it's particularly interesting to just be like, oh, if they had a fight, this character would win. So I tend to do it more on a sort of score system of like, if the characters fought 7 times, who would win, you know, what proportion of those 7. So obviously that means a 7-0 sweep means the character was just way better, it wasn't even close. A 4-3 win means it was very tight and one character is just slightly better than the other one, and you could almost reverse it. And then you have these sort of middle scores of like 6-1, they'd grab, the weaker character would grab one match, they're good enough for that. And then 5-2 is just highlighting that they're kind of equal, but one character is just a bit better, that it always sort of comes to the forefront. So that's the explanation of this. So let's jump in. The first fight is Ming-Hua versus Katara. So Waterbenders, Red Lotus versus ATLA Team Avatar member. Now, I personally don't find this fight to be particularly close. I think I would just straight off the bat be like, yeah, this is pretty much 7-0 Katara. Because here's the thing with Katara. I rate Katara as being the best Yukon, Amon, Tarlok waterbender in the series. That's where I rate her. She's the best of the normal waterbenders. Ming-Hua is on that list, but is further down, of course. So it's close-ish. It's not just a Katara just wins, but across 7 fights, I think Katara would win all of those 7 fights. I just don't see what Ming-Hua is bringing here that Katara is not immediately able to defend against. Ming-Hua, of course, has the sort of aggressive mentality of the Red Lotus. She's going to go in for the kill. She has, you know, a strong connection to water because, you know, she makes up for the fact that she doesn't have arms by being very connected to her water to have those water arms. And so because of that, she has some very unique techniques. But I think Katara, with the experience that she has of like, she knows northern style waterbending, she's experienced with southern style waterbending, she saw Foggy Swamp style bloodbending. I'm not counting bloodbending in this fight, that's just not a factor, I don't think that's fair to include. But just she to me feels like she wouldn't be flustered by anything that Ming-Hua does. And then the other thing is that a lot of people tend to associate, oh, Ming-Hua, like, she's cool, she has the water arms. But I don't think we entirely know how Ming-Hua would do against a very powerful waterbender, in terms of, could a very powerful waterbender not manipulate the water that Ming-Hua's arms are made out of? Even if that's not necessarily the case, maybe she is so connected in they can't do that, I still think the likes of a Katara, Pakku, Unalaq, those characters could mess with Ming-Hua's waterbending in terms of her arms, and that would you know, cause her actual disability to actually become a weakness in the battle. So that's the thing here. Like, you know, I'm at times inclined with some of these fights where I feel it's pretty in favor of one character to be like, but this character is dangerous enough to where they probably take one of those matches. I don't think that's quite the case here. I think unfortunately Ming-Hua is on the weaker end of the Red Lotus members, and I don't quite just see her be... I can't picture a scenario where Ming-Hua takes one of those fights. So that's why I don't think there's too much to go into detail there. I just think Katara very much does take that. The other point I'll bring up here that will sort of be valid across all of the other fights, and it mainly refers to when we're talking about the ATLA characters here. When we encounter them in ATLA, they are somewhere between the ages of like 12 and 16, and even in the comics they're only like, you know, 15 to like 18, 19. Not all the characters are fully grown, they're not at their prime or anything like that, versus say Red Lotus members who are at their prime and at their best. For the fairness in these fights, I think you have to even the playing field that little bit. So that means, like, I was considering basically Ming-Hua as we see her versus basically Katara in her prime, which would be like, say, 25-year-old Katara, which means she has, like, 7-8 years more experience as a bender, and is fully grown, I suppose, at that point as well, and is just so much more experienced, and has the same sort of experience level as Ming-Hua. And I think that's another factor that goes in. I think if we did say 16-year-old Katara versus Ming-Hua, I'd still give it to Katara, but it'd maybe be like 6-1. But if it's Katara in her prime against Ming-Hua, I think it's 7-0 full stop. And that's in my mind, that's the fairest way to do it, because otherwise then you just have these situations of just like, purely because of age, this character wins. So next fight is Toph versus Ghazan. So that factor is going to come in here as well. I think I would score like 12 to 14-year-old Toph versus Ghazan differently than I would 25-year-old Toph versus Ghazan. Even though, again, we're not familiar with the exact skill level of our ATLA crew at those ages, I think it's one of those things where a lot of our ATLA crew are prodigies at their element and are going to get better as time goes on. I think the biggest evidence of that is something like, say, Aang, when we see him in the Book 1 Air flashback. You can see he's much more powerful at 40 than he was as we see him now in the comics and so on. So you can take that growth and sort of apply it to the other characters as well. But anyway, so for the sake of this, I'm more or less considering this to be like Toph in her 20s against Ghazan. Now this fight is an interesting one because it is basically earth and metal against earth and lava. So immediately, earth versus earth. The fight goes to Toph. Toph, I think, is just a superior earthbender to Ghazan. I think we saw from previous fights that Bolin was a pretty even match for Ghazan, just straight up earthbending. So I think Toph would absolutely be the superior standard earthbender. So Ghazan would realize very quickly he's going to need to have to rely on his lava bending to get anywhere in the fight against Toph. But Toph has her superior earthbending and her ability to kind of do more big stuff, more subtle stuff than Ghazan would earth, but then also to bring in the metal bending to defend herself against the lava. The difference here, I think the difference between Ming-Hua and Ghazan is that Ghazan is sort of more of a lethal threat as a bender. So to me, the idea is that lava bending, any amount of that lava that gets through and hits Toph immediately turns the fight in Ghazan's favor. So that's something you can't just kind of completely exclude. That, like, this is not a 7-0 sweep, because Ghazan's going to get some of that through in one of those fights that they have. So I still think Toph takes this quite comfortably, but I'm going to say 6-1 here to Toph. Just because I can see a situation where Toph defends most of the lava, but a little droplet basically of it gets through, like hits her on the arm or something like that. She sort of hesitates for a second, and Ghazan presses the advantage and kind of bursts through and gets the win. But I think most of the time the way that this fight goes, Ghazan is on the offensive off the start because he's better on offense than defense. Toph would wait before striking. She'd defend pretty well against his initial lava barrage, whether that be with big earth walls, redirecting his lava, or bringing metal into play. And then I think she would counterattack very effectively. Again, we're kind of talking like Chief of Police Toph here, so I think she'd have the kind of metal bender police force, spools of metal wire. And I think she'd be able to use that very effectively, any metal that's scattered around wherever they're fighting. And then I think with subtle, seismic sense style stuff, really taking advantage of being more aware of the surroundings, I think she would get him off balance and eventually burst through. Just the fact that we saw that Ghazan's defenses aren't the best, in that Mako and Bolin teamed up for just a little bit and Ghazan was straight away on the back foot. His defenses really fell apart quite quickly. I think Toph would absolutely have the firepower to cause that to happen more often than not. So definitely 6-1 to Toph in this one. I don't want to undervalue Ghazan, but I think a lot of what I said there was pretty fair. Toph wins the earthbending exchanges. Lava bending would be a constant threat throughout the fight, but I think Toph will be able to handle it for most of the time. Her blindness, you know, it might affect her in some cases in the sense of like, if Ghazan is really chucking the lava around and it starts sort of like separating, like droplets start coming off, I could see her getting hit maybe a few times. But if she's wearing her metal bender outfit, you know, she'd be able to defend against the sort of stray droplets most of the time. But that's why I give him one of those victories. But yeah, 6-1, very comfortable still. Next up is Toph versus Korra. Now, immediately with an avatar coming into play here, I think we have to clarify that I think the intent behind this would be Toph versus Korra, where Korra can't use the avatar state. Because if Korra can use the avatar state, it's 7-0 Korra every time. I don't think you can undervalue the avatar state that much, because you always, most of the time we see the avatar state fight anyone, they always have to weaken it in some way or empower the villain in another way. A standard bender realistically cannot go up against the avatar state. Even if it's Toph, I don't see any way where you can honestly say Toph defeats Korra in the avatar state. Even if you make all the caveats of like Korra's avatar state is weaker than it's been before because the past lives are gone and stuff like that, no. She still gets the power boost from Rava merging with her. She can still do huge bending attacks, and I think that would overwhelm Toph. So, avatar state at 7-0 Korra. Non-avatar state, it's a bit of a different story. So again, in this case, we're treating it as like it's older Toph in her 20s versus Korra in her 20s. It's an interesting fight because, of course, it's a character who can use all 4 elements, but Korra is also a metal bender. So the metal bending, while Toph will be better than Korra at metal bending, it doesn't give her this like inherent like huge advantage. Toph's 2 skills that she has versus Korra's 2 skills, she'd be better at. But Korra has fire to counter with, water to counter with, and I think more importantly, air to counter with. And we know Toph doesn't do particularly well against airbenders. Now, admittedly, they've never really shown her fighting airbenders like that much. So it might take kind of Korra a little bit to figure out that if she really emphasizes airbending and being light on her feet, staying in the air a little bit more and not disturbing the air too much, she could, I think, stay out of Toph's kind of range. She could stay out of Toph's, you know, seismic sight or whatever way you want to call it. And I think she could get a similar sort of surprise advantage that like Aang did when he kind of took Toph completely by surprise. Now, of course, Toph has developed since then to be more aware of like kind of stuff through the air and so on, like heightened her senses. But I still think it's one of those situations where an airbender could take advantage in that way. So, you know, you can't underestimate the just raw power of having all 4 elements, the variety that there is in play. And if we're doing like 25-year-old Toph, we're talking about 25-year-old Korra. So that's 4 more years of experience for Korra as well, being a kind of multi-element bender. And I think it's tight. I don't think this is like, to me, this has to be a 4-3. This is definitely a 4-3 either way. There's no way this is a sweep for either character. I don't think this is 5-2 either character. It's not 6-1 either character. It's 4-3 one way or the other. I'm not exactly sure which way I want to go here. Just because, you know, it's Toph as being hyper-focused in one direction of the earth and metal. Like, she is superior to Korra in those areas. But how does Toph fend off against Korra using the other stuff? That's what I'm not as sure about. I think, you know, it means that's why Korra can get victories over Toph within this fight. But does Toph just being sort of the best at what she's doing give her the advantage in that area? I'm probably going to lean slightly in the direction of Korra here. But again, treat this as being one of the ones that for me is like the most sort of 50-50. Like I said, I'm going to slightly lean 4-3 Korra, but I'm conflicted about it. Next fight is Korra versus Aang. And the person who asked this was specifically kind of made some notes about, you know, making sure that I wasn't like biased or anything like that when I discussed it. And I suppose what he's talking about there is mainly this idea that there's a few different ways you can be biased towards this specific fight. One, it's the main character of both series, so they're Your preference for either series can lean you in one way or the other. The other thing with this is, of course, just in terms of like if you treat it as being Aang as we see him in ATLA versus Korra in Korra, it's you automatically lean towards Korra just because she's 21 by the end of the show, and Aang is still only like just about 13. So it's, you know, a kind of fully grown woman versus like a boy basically, and Korra is very physical and stuff like that. So that's the slight advantage there. But like I said, for these, I'm treating this as more of if the characters were in their prime versus just, you know, 12 versus 21 type thing. So this is, like I said, 25-year-old Korra versus about 25-year-old Aang. And with Avatar State here, both characters have it. Again, I find it very difficult to analyze Avatar State fights in terms of like, oh, this character wins because of this, because the Avatar State, when it's used, is often just used in the big ways. It's just as big attacks as possible. You sort of almost remove the cleverness from the situation because it's just all about power at that point. How does Aang having the past lives differ from Korra not having them anymore? The impression I get based on the information that we have is that it is specifically stated that it is like the skill and kind of wisdom / knowledge of the past lives. It is not the power as such of the past lives. So it is not this case of like Aang is like 100 times more powerful in the Avatar State than Korra is. No, in the Avatar State, Aang has access to sort of techniques and kind of wisdom styles, I suppose, effectively, that past avatars used. Probably the most clear example of this might be the idea of, we've seen avatars in the Avatar State in the past use lava bending. Clearly because a previous avatar was a lava bender. We don't know the specifics on that or anything. So does Korra not have access to that in the Avatar State anymore because the past lives are gone? She only has herself and Rava, whereas Aang has access to all of that stuff, but obviously not Korra. So the idea is that Korra going forward technically introduces metal bending to be used by the Avatar State, even if the Avatar in their sort of base form doesn't have metal bending going forward. So that's sort of the one thing there of like, you know, okay, Aang's Avatar State is slightly more powerful than Korra's just because of extra techniques and I suppose knowledge, wisdom coming into play. But the power level is still basically the same between them. You know, maybe the edge slightly towards Aang, but what are we really talking about at that point? So let's exclude Avatar State with this fight. What are we talking about here? With the characters in their primes, we are talking about both able to bend all 4 elements. Korra can also do metal bending, and the main thing here I think to add in would be that Aang suddenly jumps up a massive amount because you basically are like doubling his age from where we have it right now. He goes from being sort of a boy past being a teenager to all of a sudden he's fully grown. And we see Aang at 40 years old and how much taller he is and more physical and so on. And so with that growth also comes sort of a growth in, you know, his chi network as well. So just the pure, you know, aging of the character increases his power level greatly. Whereas I think we see Korra just about at her peak as we end the show. In a few years, like if they're both 25, Korra is not going to be changing as much as Aang is changing for where he is now. In that, if it was kind of 12 to 16-year-old Aang versus 21-year-old Korra, you'd probably give Korra the victory 4-3, but reversing it, it's probably more like 4-3 Aang or maybe even 5-2 Aang. And that's the impression I get of just like, I think Aang is just going to be so skilled and just powerful when he is at his peak, that as good as Korra is, as physical as she is, the advantage of having that metal bending that Aang won't have, I think Aang is kind of just going to be on that sort of other level. So this is another one of those ones, kind of slight asterisks behind it, but if you just do sort of the characters at the end of their series against each other, it probably you have to lean in Korra's direction. But if you go for the sort of fight at its fairest, it probably is Aang somewhat decently comfortable. Just because I think he's bringing so much to the table at that point, because, you know, he he goes from being kind of boy teenager to man, and I think that changes things quite a lot. Just in the sense of, like, in the fight against Ozai, look how well he held himself, even without using the Avatar state, against Ozai. And imagine how that fight would have gone if Aang was actually, like, in his 20s when that happened. I think it'd be, like, he'd be so much more in that fight than he was already. So I think, you know, it highlights that Aang is incredible at the age that he's at there. But if we make him into his prime, he's just a whole other level. So there's that. 4-3 Korra if it's normal. 5-2 Aang if it's in their primes. Next up, we have Ozai versus Zaheer. So this is a very interesting one. I think the person who asked this one specifically said Zaheer with his flight. So we're not disabling his ability to float and fly and so on, that airbending special move. So he has that. And obviously it's Ozai without the comet as well. And my initial impression here is that I lean quite heavily in Ozai's favor. I don't think it's 7-0, but I still would be quite heavily Ozai, like, very comfortably in this fight. And the reason for that is because I don't rate Zaheer as being super top tier as a fighter. We saw him go one-on-one with Tenzin, admittedly before he had his flight, but still one-on-one with Tenzin, and Tenzin had him covered completely, highlighting that Zaheer is not a master airbender. He is a good martial artist who incorporates that well with having airbending now, but he's not using the element at its best because he has no actual airbending training. So to me, if this was Zaheer without flight, I would say 7-0 Ozai every single time. I don't see any way Zaheer gets the advantage. With the flight, I think the flight is the one thing that I think gives Zaheer a chance in this fight. And I think it means Zaheer takes at least one of these fights just because of that ability and the movement that it offers, and just how effortlessly he can dodge things, you know, zip in and potentially grab Ozai by surprise and so on. But this is a case where I don't know how much you can sort of big up Zaheer purely on the basis of his fight against Korra in the Avatar state, because there are so many caveats basically about why the Avatar state was the way it was there. One, Korra was poisoned, so the Avatar state was not as at its peak level. It wasn't firing on all cylinders. Two, the way that fight ended up going, because it was against the defense mechanism Avatar, was that Zaheer basically just ran away the entire time. The Avatar state chased, no tactics whatsoever, just went for big moves. Zaheer dodged, grabs Korra, flings her into a mountain. Ozai's not going to do that. For one, without the comet, he's not going to be able to fly in the air for extended periods of time. Based on other characters, it seems like he could probably burst his way up into the air and maybe air dodge a few times, but he's not going to be able to sustain flight for a large period of time or anything like that. So Ozai is just literally in this fight not going to be able to just chase after Zaheer and basically walk into the flaws of that fight against Zaheer and Korra. And then the other thing with Ozai, like, it's obviously tough to fully rate exactly where Ozai is, because we only ever see him fight with Sozin's Comet, and then the one time we see him bend without it, it's just lightning generation. Now, admittedly, it's very powerful lightning generation, because it's the second the glimpse of the sun comes back after the eclipse, he's straight on, just boom, super powerful lightning from a sort of not perfect position, and he just forms powerful lightning, like, effortlessly. So he has that thing of, like, you know, surprise lightning attack out of nowhere is something that's always on the table with Ozai. And I think that's where Zaheer could get himself in trouble. If he sees an opening with Ozai and tries to swoop in with his flying and, like, grab Ozai and, like, throw him into a mountain or something, I think Ozai could just suddenly just counter and just be like, boom, and there's Zaheer gone. Similarly, you take a lot of Ozai Sozin's Comet style stuff and, like, limit it down to normal levels, and, you know, Iroh basically says, like, I don't know if I could take him in a fight effectively. It's not the exact line of dialogue, but Iroh is being very cautious and respectful of his brother's power, highlighting that they're in or around the same level to a degree. Now, I think most fans would lean Iroh's better than Ozai, but still, Iroh rates him as being close to him, at least. And that can't be underestimated. Like, he's going to be doing some incredibly impressive firebending. That if we rate Azula as being crazy high, that Ozai must also be basically in or around that level also, doing kind of very, very impressive moves. And being... the impression I get is that, like, Ozai is going to be somewhat of a blend of, like, not quite as sort of athletic and sort of, gymnastic in a way as Azula, but not quite as, rooted, grounded, I suppose, in a way as Iroh is. Somewhere in between those two is probably where Ozai's style is. So he's going to be athletic, he's going to be able to dodge Zaheer, he's going to be able to put out a lot of power with both lightning and his normal firebending. He's going to be aggressive in this fight and keep Zaheer flying around. And like I said, he always has that lightning, sudden, fast draw on the lightning to get the advantage. And I just don't see what Zaheer is going to offer necessarily. Like I said, the flight, I think, is the thing keeping him in this fight. He could swoop down and grab him suddenly. But with his normal airbending, I think Ozai's raw power and technique is just going to be superior to Zaheer if they get into a battle on the ground. Ozai might get sort of blown about a bit, like constantly getting knocked back, but I think his power is just going to burst through. And if Zaheer doesn't stay on the defensive, Ozai is just going to, I think, overwhelm him. Because I don't think Zaheer has the raw airbending skill to defend against power of that level just with air. So he's going to have to rely on dodging. And I don't think he can dodge forever. And I can't see any way how almost anyone can frame this fight as being, out of 7 fights, Zaheer wins more of them than Ozai. I just cannot see that happening. So right now I'm kind of like 6-1 Ozai is probably what I'm going to say here. And I think that's being pretty fair to both. Zaheer is going to be very good against a lot of your sort of mid-tier to slightly high-tier characters, but I think against the top-line characters, a lot of characters are going to really dominate Zaheer. That's where I rate him, honestly. That purely him being willing to go for the kill isn't enough of a trait to win all these fights. I don't think he's as skilled as a lot of people make him out to be. Next up, Combustion Man versus Pai, so a battle of the Combustion Benders. This one I think is pretty simple. I think it's 7-0 Pai or 6-1 Pai. And the only reason I in any way say like 6-1 Pai is purely that at the time when you're having two Combustion Benders fight each other, you're basically flipping a coin, rolling a dice of like, they are putting out death blows every time they use their ability. And if they're going to be just standing across from each other, firing at each other, these fights aren't going to last very long. They're going to dodge one or two, and then inevitably someone will, hesitate, get hit, get clipped, and just get blown up. And that's the way that this is going to go. There's going to be no cleverness of trying to like turn off each other's, third chakra point with something. This is going to be pretty much fought from distance. And I think Pai having the ability to curve her combustion blasts just gives her an insane advantage in this one. That the only reason I in any way say 6-1 Pai and rather than 7-0 is that inevitably you could see a scenario where Combustion Man just gets one of his blasts through and Pai can't quite dodge it. But the same applies in reverse, so 7-0 is fair enough. And that's why I'm probably going to just say 7-0 because Pai, as far as we are aware, her having that extra control over her combustion blast of being able to curve them doesn't take away from the overall power of the blasts. So I don't really think we can say that Combustion Man's explosions are more powerful than Pai's. So Pai's control is just a raw advantage. We've seen Pai do actual firebending more than Combustion Man, to the point where we're not even sure if Combustion Man can or at all uses normal firebending when he fights. I think we would have seen him use it if he could, but he doesn't. And the reason I lean in that direction is because one of his hands is missing, and it's metal now, and one of his legs is missing. He obviously is immediately limited. Even if he can do normal firebending, he's going to be extremely limited on one hand and one leg, meaning he only has 2 of his limbs to actually normally firebend with. Whereas Pai doesn't have that limitation. Now, both characters are actually super agile. We've seen Combustion Man being able to like move fairly well, so he's not super hindered by the fact that his leg is like that. We've seen him do these crazy jumps and combat rolls to get into positions and so on. But similarly, Peli is equally as agile, so that's why I picture a lot of these fights as just being, they stand off from each other, fire their first blast, they kind of circle around and dodge each other, fire again, fire again. But to me, the way this fight goes every time is they fire blast at each other, explodes in the middle, they move across, they do the same thing again, and then on the third time, Peli actually activates the curving this time around. So she curves her blast around his, she dodges his one, she jumps out of the way, he gets hit, it's over. To me, that's the way this fight goes pretty much every time. It's a pretty simple fight, I think. So yeah, like, make your pick. Is it 7-0 Peli or is it 6-1 Peli? It's up to you to determine how likely is Peli to just like slightly make a mistake and lose one of those fights when she has the clear advantage. It's up to you, really. Next up, Bumi versus Ghazan. I think this is very similar to Toph versus Ghazan in the sense of like you trade Toph having metal for Bumi having a very unique philosophy and style of fighting. Because he's so old and experienced, he is so familiar with different forms. He's not just your standard earthbender, he can be that, but he can incorporate all this other stuff into it, and that there's a little bit of an element of almost airbending to what he does with some of the spiral movements, the inventiveness of some of his earthbending as well. He has a little bit of fun with it. I think Ghazan would be taken a little bit aback by what Bumi is doing. That Bumi is one of your most powerful standard earthbenders, so he is superior to Ghazan on that level. And I think Bumi can put out enough earth to block Ghazan effectively, block his lava bending effectively. I think he's going to be dodging Ghazan's lava in very unique ways by, like what happens with Aang, where like he falls back into the ground and like appears somewhere else. He's just going to like tunnel around the place and pop up where Ghazan least expects it. And he can do all these clever moves like quickly turn the ground in front of him into quicksand and limit Ghazan's movement and so on. While also being a huge powerhouse. It's one of those ones where like with Toph, I just see no way where just consistently Ghazan is just going to dominate Bumi in these fights. So the same with Toph, I think this is 6-1 Bumi. Maybe in this case, without the defensiveness of having your metal bending, you could maybe make a case for 5-2 Bumi, but I don't really see Ghazan being able to quite win here. I think when Bumi goes on the offensive, Ghazan's defenses won't be able to hold up. Because like lava bending, it's defensive in terms of a big team battle, being able to change the landscape of a fight like that, but it's not a defensive ability. So his defenses are his earth bending, which I think is fair to say isn't as good as some of the true masters that we've seen. The fact that Bolin, like I said earlier, was able to match up to Ghazan's standard earthbending highlights that Toph or Bumi are going to be superior on that level. So, yeah, I think the mad genius persona of Bumi will give him the advantage over Ghazan. So, yeah. And it may seem like I'm being very harsh on Ghazan, but like, the second we bring in anyone below Toph and Bumi's level, I think it's a much more interesting fight to discuss with Ghazan. Next one is kind of more of a fun one. It is Avatar Kuruk versus Iroh, but in a Pai Sho game. So we'll treat it the same way. If they played 7 times, what would be the score? Now, okay, here's the analysis. Avatar Kuruk from the Avatar Kyoshi novel is stated to be a prodigy, basically, at Pai Sho. He is incredible at this game. Like, extraordinarily skilled. Like, he wins, like, every game he plays. He is pretty much unbeatable at this game. He is so good. Again, they don't go into a lot of specifics, and not like, okay, he has a lot of unique strategies, I think is the idea that they get across. What is it? Yoon ends up using some of the same strategies Kuruk had, and that's one of the reasons he's sort of almost considered to be the Avatar at the start of the book. But yeah, so you've got a player who is very competitive, always wants to win, that is Kuruk's style, versus Iroh, who, as far as we are aware, like, is good at the game, but I don't think it's ever been stated that, like, he is this guy who, like, never loses. He mainly plays against, like, the members of, like, Zuko's crew, and so obviously he's going to win against them. And then the other thing we get is that he's Order of the White Lotus, so he has a unique style that incorporates the White Lotus tile into it, when the White Lotus tile tends to be a very underappreciated piece by most players. So the idea here of this matchup is that typically Kuruk is going to win. But how does Kuruk view the White Lotus strategy, and how good is the White Lotus strategy? So I don't think it's a 7-0 sweep, but I'm going to say like 5-2 Kuruk, just because he seems to be established to be just sort of unbeatable at this game. But I think Iroh will surprise him every so often with the uniqueness of the White Lotus tile gambit as the strategy. But yeah, I struggle to be able to say that for sure Iroh's specific strategy would be Kuruk every single time. I don't think that's fair to say. Final one for this video is going to be Unalaq versus Katara. Now, for some people, this is where I'd be kind of like biased towards other people. Now, immediately they're going to counter, but like, oh, you're going to be biased towards Unalaq because you like him, whereas I'm going to be saying other people who usually analyze Unalaq are going to be biased against him. I think I'm pretty good about treating Unalaq fairly. And I think it's a much more obviously extreme thing within the fandom of like the severe hatred towards the character. But yeah, so it's fair to say Katara is going to win this one. I do rate Katara as being better than Unalaq, but I think it's closer than we think. It's not a 4-3 Katara, but it's also not a 7-0 Katara. I don't think it is even 6-1 Katara. I'm actually going to say 5-2 Katara on this one. Now, let's get into the analysis here after the result. So, like we've discussed with Katara, she's sort of this, jack of all trades, and kind of a master of everything as well. So she sort of represents sort of the best of everything when it comes to waterbending. She just, like her raw experience of having northern style, southern style, foggy swamp style, just familiar with all these different things. She has the healing. The only thing you wouldn't say is that like Unalaq has the sort of spirituality, the spiritual connection to the element that gives him a slightly different kind of approach in battle. That kind of is like, okay, so Katara's not going to win this one just on pure. She's connected more to her element than Unalaq, because she might be surprised at just how deep the connection goes with him. He's going to be a very skilled opponent for her in terms of like, she knows the likes of Pakku is very strong, but I would actually rate Unalaq as being more powerful than Pakku. I think Unalaq is kind of like you take Pakku to sort of like the next level, where you add in that villainous streak where he's willing to do these really, really kind of crazy moves that can kind of finish the fight quickly. And I think it's just moments like when you see how easy in a way the victory of Unalaq over Tonraq was, and you see like if you go for the simple waterbending style, he is going to take advantage of you because he's more technique focused, more subtle, more elegant in his style, and it's going to be much more even than you think. There's going to be a lot of, I think, beautiful waterbending going on in this fight. A lot of interesting technique I think happening in this one that's going to be very interesting to see. It's a fight I'd actually really, really love to see. Again, I think this one, it's kind of hard to picture exactly how it would go necessarily, in terms of neither one feels like the particular aggressor in this fight. It feels like it would be very like slow at the start, neither of them wanting to be the aggressor, like them each wanting the other to strike first so they can sort of redirect it and get that whole waterbending style going of like using your opponent's force against them, and then it would just kind of build up until like who eventually counters the other one the hardest to where it's like impossible to block. But I think there'd be some nice kind of great uses of just like constantly switching between water and ice, and maybe the mist or steam sort of brought out at sort of the last minute. It would be a clever fight, because I think both characters are very intelligent in terms of how they fight. They're both going to use the sort of landscape wherever they're fighting to their advantage. Like, you'd give Katara the edge, I think, in scenarios where maybe they fight in an arena where maybe water is scarce. I think Katara would make better use of like a limited amount of water, whereas I think Unalaq is much more dependent on having a lot of water around and making sure that fight is in an area where he can do all of his moves. So I think Katara kind of like adapts more to a variety of different locations and environments and so on. And overall, like as a fight goes and evolves, I think would be more adaptable to like the situation, like as it kind of progresses and so on. Again, we're not really bringing bloodbending into play here. Maybe this is a scenario where maybe if the full moon is out and we're not doing bloodbending, and just the waterbenders are at their most powerful, that is maybe a scenario where Unalaq maybe would shine a little bit brighter than Katara, of just the spiritual enhancement in a way to waterbending by the moon. And Unalaq being so spiritual, like you could see him maybe pulling out some really high-end waterbending moves that maybe Katara wouldn't have thought of, because he's coming at it from sort of a different perspective of having such a spiritual view on things, in addition to being Red Lotus and having that sort of more killer mentality than she does. That's maybe where like Unalaq gets his victories from. It's just surprising Katara with some kind of unique move that is just kind of she can't quite defend against. But most of the time, I think Katara would get the advantage here. And the way I suppose you sort of see it going is that Katara is not just going to sort of dominate and just suddenly like, you know, take someone out. That's the way I think, you know, to view Katara in most of these fights. Even against like Ming-Hua, I don't see Katara just doing like 2-3 moves and Ming-Hua's taken out. This is a fight that sort of goes on for, I think, a little bit of an extended period of time, and she sort of maneuvers her way into the fight, kind of defending against their attacks, taking her advantages when she needs to, and then striking at the exact right moment to kind of take the victory. Like, you know, if Katara maybe has maybe a slight maybe like weakness as a character, is just that like, does she necessarily have those killer moves, and are they better kind of killer moves than her opponents? She's the best sort of jack of all trades character to stay in the fight sort of the longest, but because she has that experience from all the different tribes and stuff like that, experiencing all aspects of waterbending, she's gonna bring something new out or something like that, and that's where I think she would take the advantage overall. But again, it's more even than you think. So 5-2 Katara on that one. And yeah, there's still a bunch of other fights that you guys have sent in. If this video does pretty well, I'll probably do a second video covering those other fights. But in the comments, let me know your thoughts on the fights that I mentioned here, as well as what I talked about as I went through them. But yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.